Welcome to Case by Case. This is a podcast brought to you by Calum Chain and Luke Sadkovich from ZFZ. How are you today, Calum?
Very good, Luke. How are you doing?
Good. I think we introduce these things exactly the same way every single time. You're always good. I'm good. I always ask you how you are.
I was thinking, we've actually not been on the podcast together for a couple of weeks now. I've been away on holiday, and we had one where it was Philip and I, and then one where it was you and Romina. So this is the first time in 3 weeks, I think, that we're back together on the pod.
That's a good point. It seems like a long period of time. I think it's probably the first time that we've gone to back-to-back episodes without the two of us on.
Our listeners probably thinking there's been some kind of feud or artistic differences.
Well, there always is, but you know,
constant feuds. But normally we have them on air.
But so I don't know. Are we going to argue much about today's case, Calum? What do you think?
You never know, but I'm not sure there's a huge amount to argue over, really.
No, I don't think so either. Well, what about this? Do you think we can wrap this up in 10 minutes?
Let's try it.
That's punchy, but let's give it a crack, eh?
Let's go 10 minutes starting now, though.
Okay, 10 minutes starting now. Okay, I've clocked the time on my computer. So we are talking today about Lloyd's Maritime Law Newsletter case, London Arbitration 3/23. We have a short summary of a London Arbitration award. This is a maritime case for those of you that listen in that love all things maritime. And in particular, we're looking at bunkers on redelivery under a time charter party, and where bunkers, where an excess of bunkers are left on board the ship at the end of a time charter party, whether that's a breach, not a breach, whether the master overestimated the quantity required during the voyage, and then if there's a breach, what are the appropriate damages here, or what's the pricing that should apply to calculate the value of those excess bunkers and compensate the owners accordingly. So yeah, that's what we're talking about. All about bunkers and bunkering ships.
And these are the kind of disputes that often they're almost the addendum disputes to other charter party claims. When you have the big statements of account dispute where there's, you know, a bunch of off hire that you're discussing, or some other large claim that you're discussing, and then there's also this claim kind of tacked on of, oh, actually there were 100 extra metric tons of fuel oil on board on redelivery. What do we do about that? I think because of that, there's not great law on how to deal with these types of cases. I think one, for the reason that it rarely gets to the court. It would be quite odd to be in a situation where you have enough bunkers on board for it to really make enough of a difference for it to go through an arbitration. And normally these charters will be subject to arbitration and then get to the court and be worth the fight. And also, I think because there can be so many different types of situations, you can have a charter party that provides for the price of bunkers on redelivery. You can have a charter party that doesn't. You can have a charter party that provides for the quantity of bunkers, but gives you some kind of tolerance. There are so many different movable parts that finding a clear principle through to what the law says is how we should assess these claims is a slightly tricky thing to do.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Calum. And we're not talking about big sums of money here. I think we're looking at a fluctuation one way or the other, depending on whether owners or charterers are correct, of somewhere in the vicinity of $4,000 to $6,000 up to maybe $12,000 or $13,000. So not a big claim, but of course, if you're in this business, they add up. All right, you do many of these charters, whether you're owners or charterers, and 10K here, 10K there adds up, and so getting some clear guidance on this, I think, is welcome. And a lot of our clients will appreciate it, whether they necessarily agree with the answer or not, we'll see. But getting guidance on how to make these calculations is certainly useful. And as you say, we typically don't see them getting all the way to a full award because of the sums involved. And so here, as I said, we're dealing with an actual summary of the award. We don't have the full award. It's about a page and a half. And this one, unlike some of the more recent newsletter summaries that we've seen for LMAA decisions, This is a relatively short one. We've seen some that have gone up to 3, 4, 5 pages, pretty much because there's not that much in this case, I think, to have a lengthy report. So it's to the point, nice and punchy, easy to understand, and I think quite useful. Should we set out the facts briefly, Calum?
Let's do it. So the charterers take the ship. It's an NYP form, and people who listen to the podcast who are familiar with shipping will be familiar with the concept under a time charter of the charterer buying the bunkers on board on delivery. So almost like like when you hire a car, you take the car and you get the tank, and the tank's full, and that fuel is yours, but you have to return it with a full tank. Except in the charter party context, the charterers, when they take the ship, they take it with a tank which is maybe 50% full, maybe 100% full. You don't really know, but what you do know is that when you get the ship, there'll be some measurement saying, okay, this is the amount of bunkers that are on board on delivery, and you buy those bunkers from owners, and then at the end of the charter party, you account back to owners for those bunkers by owners purchasing whatever remains on board back from you. And the issue here was that when charterers redelivered the ship, there were more bunkers on board than they had agreed there would be. So normally, the way that you normally see this is that there is there's an obligation on the charterer to redeliver with about the same amount of fuel on redelivery as they took the ship with on delivery. And that was the case here. So they took the ship with 453 metric tons of IFO and 53 metric tons of MGO, and they redelivered with 660 metric tons of IFO and 60 metric tons of MGO. So only a little bit of extra MGO and a reasonably large amount of additional IFO. And this is where this case starts to diverge from a lot of other cases that you might see. Here, at least on my reading of this report, the charter party didn't stipulate the cost for the bunkers on redelivery. The amount that the owner would pay to the charterer for the bunkers on redelivery didn't seem to be stipulated in the charter. In some cases, it will be. And you see sometimes that the parties have almost agreed a pass through of the bunker costs by saying you will pay X amount per metric ton on redelivery, and you will redeliver, and on redelivery, owners will pay the same amount per metric ton on redelivery, and the charterers basically bear the risk of the bunker price going up or down during the voyage. In other cases, the amount that the owner pays on redelivery for the bunkers could be based on market rates at the discharge port, and that's quite an important distinction for the purpose of this case, because the tribunal spent a lot of time looking at how they should assess the value of the bunkers on redelivery.
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes it's quite clear, and you can alleviate these disputes with a clause setting out what the price will be on that redelivery. At redelivery, whereas here it was left open, and so we've got this question now, like, how do you price those bunkers at the end of the charter? But before we come on to pricing, we've got a question as to who was in the right and who was in the wrong here. Yeah, I know. I thought that too. Charterers were arguing that the master had substantially overestimated the quantity of the bunkers that would be required for the voyage, and by doing so, that amounted to a breach of the charter. So, in effect, what the charterers are saying is, well, the reason that we ended up with more bunkers on board at the end of this charter was because the master overestimated the quantity of bunkers, and so there's a couple of points in that. One, did the master overestimate? Was it unreasonable for the master to estimate in the way that he or she did? And secondly, was that a breach? And so the tribunal looked at this and the summary we've got here is pretty short shrift, I think. I'd just say, often in our experience, it's difficult to criticize a master and how a master approaches these types of things. It's not impossible, and yes, if there's clear evidence the master's done the wrong thing, sure. But I would just say at a threshold level, it is difficult to argue that masters have done the wrong thing in these types of things, and you really need some persuasive evidence to do that. I don't think that existed here. And indeed, the tribunal went on to say that the master's estimates were not unreasonable. There was a safety margin that the master had allowed in the figures that he or she had estimated, or he had estimated, and that was about 20% of what he would need for the whole voyage. The calculations for the port time, they were also reasonable. It wasn't like a figure that was outside of what you kind of expect. It was kind of about the voyage plus a bit for tolerance. And the tribunal said that was reasonable. So the charters really didn't get past first base on this argument, let alone whether it was in fact a breach.
Yeah, and it also seemed as though the master's calculations weren't too dissimilar from the charterer's calculations. So that's always going to be a difficult point to argue back from if you're the charterer. You say the masters acted unreasonably, but we actually were equally unreasonable in our assessment of the amount of bunkers that we needed.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they got rid of that. So the tribunal said, no, we don't think the master had acted unreasonably here. And so that then flips it on its head. The charterers were obliged to redeliver the ship with a certain amount of bunkers on board as set out on delivery, and they didn't. They delivered the ship back with more bunkers than they should have, and that was a straightforward breach of the charter. The question then becomes, well, what's the compensation that owners should be paid by virtue of charterer's breach?
Yeah, and it seemed to me here, reading through it, and I wasn't certain, but it seemed to me that basically charterers were saying, owners, you have to buy these bunkers back from us at a high cost, because the cost of the bunker, the market's gone up, the value of these bunkers is now high. You need to buy them back from us, and our breach doesn't really matter because you are responsible for purchasing these bunkers back from us. Owners were then saying, no, you're in breach, and we wouldn't have otherwise had to buy so many bunkers at this additional cost, and therefore your breach of redelivering with excess bunkers has caused us to buy more bunkers at an inflated price that we wouldn't otherwise have paid for them. And that's why it suggests to me that the charter party was silent on the cost of the bunkers on redelivery, or otherwise that it had some kind of market rate involved. Because you do sometimes see the opposite. You sometimes see a situation where the charter party says, as I mentioned before, the price is the same on delivery and on redelivery, and you then have a market which changes. So the charterers then think, okay, let's say the market's dropped, and the value of bunkers is 25% less than what it says in the charter party. Then sometimes a canny charterer might decide to load up on bunkers, knowing that even though they're on breach, the owner will still have the obligation to purchase from the charterer the amount of bunkers on redelivery at the charter party price, and therefore they make a margin on the bunkers. This situation, as I said at the start, this isn't something that often sees a huge amount of the light of day, because the sums in dispute are not often that large. But you do sometimes see this kind of sharp practice around loading and a lot of bunkers or stemming a few bunkers, where there's a margin to be made. And the normal position in these types of cases, and there was a London Arbitration on this a couple of years ago in 1921, which said if you're a charterer and you redeliver with an incorrect amount of bunkers on board, then owners, having purchased those bunkers back from you, can claim from you at the difference between the market rate and the charter party rate for the bunkers, that should ordinarily even things out. Taking a kind of really basic example, if the charter party says the owners are going to buy bunkers back from charterers at $200 a metric ton, and the actual market rate for those bunkers has gone up to $400 per metric ton, and owners redeliver with an extra 200 metric tons of bunker fuel, then under the charter party, the obligation of owners is to repurchase those bunkers at $200 a metric ton. Actually, this needs to be the other way around. If the charter rate was 400 and the market rate was 200, so charters go into the market, they load it up with these cheap bunkers. They say to owners, under the charter, you now need to buy these bunkers back from us. Then owners can sue charterers, and they can say, actually, at the additional rate of $200 per metric ton that we purchase those bunkers from you above the market price, above the market rate, we get to claim that back from you. So it kind of balances out, and the effect is that the owners get to buy back the entirety of the bunkers, the amount of bunkers they said they would at the charter rate, and then the remainder of the bunkers that would ultimately be treated as being at the market rate. Whereas here, in this case, it didn't seem as though there was any kind of rate in the charter. So the tribunal then goes through this exercise of trying to work out what rate should be applied. There was this slightly interesting line in the report which said that the tribunal kind of refused to engage in what they called speculation around what the position would have been if the contract was properly performed. And that slightly jumped out to me because that feels like that is kind of the tribunal's job. If you have a contractual dispute, then the recovery of the innocent party is based on what would have happened if the contract had been properly performed. And that necessarily involves some degree of speculation about what the situation would have looked like in the counterfactual world where the contract was properly performed. But here, the tribunal almost said it's too difficult to know what would have happened if this charter was properly performed because there are so many different things that owners could have done.
Yeah, interesting. Look, number one, we didn't make 10 minutes.
We didn't make 10 minutes. we may make 20.
We may make 20, which is still good for us. Yeah, so on this speculation point, what the tribunal was saying here is some of the examples that they use. They said that the owners might have taken additional bunkers at Durban, depending on the vessel's next employment. So, they didn't know what the vessel's next employment was going to be, and that may influence whether the vessel did or not take bunkers on. They might have ballasted the vessel to some other distant port where the bunkers might have been more or less expensive. Again, a matter of speculation, so they said. The owners may have delivered the vessel directly into another time charter with bunker prices that had been negotiated under that new time charter, and they said it was not really possible to resolve this speculation. So it looked to me, when I read that, Calum, that the tribunal was trying to find a formula that could apply to any given charter party in this type of situation. And I was striving to do that. Whether they've achieved that or not, that's a matter for discussion. But they say as much. They say attempting to find a principled approach which could apply to any situation where there was a failure by charters in respect of the quantity of redelivery bunkers. It occurred to the tribunal that if the redelivery quantity required by a charter was relatively small, in excess equally modest, the owners would probably have had to bunker at the nearest bunkering port. So they're saying here that they're trying to find a principled approach, but they still then going on to say, well, in a situation where we're only talking about small volumes, then this should be the outcome. Or if there was a situation where a lot of bunkers were required, this should be the outcome. And so it seemed like there's really struggling with, the different variables and coming up with a formula that applies here. And ultimately what they decided was that the tribunal should apply the Durban prices, so the prices at the discharging port, rather than those agreed in the charter party. So the prices agreed for the original purchase of the bunkers on delivery in the charter party, or those prices that were actually paid by the charters at Singapore, which was a different price again to Durban. So they're basically saying, look at it, as I understand this, look at the prices at the discharging port, where if owners had to sell the excess bunkers, for example, they'd be selling it into that market and making a loss, and that would be one way of coming up with a quantification. Or they're kind of suffering the damage, I suppose, at that time. So it kind of makes sense to look at pricing in place at the time of redelivery at the redelivery place.
And I think that's the right approach. It's consistent with London Arbitration 1921, where they said, and this was, in that case, it was just short delivery of bunkers. So the charterers had redelivered with too few bunkers on board, and owners said, you need to pay us at the market rate so that we can top up the bunkers to the level that you should have redelivered with. And the tribunal in that case found the appropriate sum per metric ton of fuel oil is the cost at the nearest bunkering port to the place of redelivery. And here the tribunal is basically saying the reverse. The tribunal is saying, even if you overload bunkers, the appropriate value is the value of purchasing bunkers at the nearest bunkering port to the place of redelivery, because if you were to, do the slightly impractical thing of taking the bunker fuel off your ship, what you have effectively got is an asset which is worth X amount. So that's how we should be assessing the value of the bunkers that have been redelivered here.
Yep, interesting.
Yeah, so I think in this situation, the tribunal, said to the parties go away and work it out. But if I understand it properly, then charterers would have ended up being in breach, but there would have been no loss suffered by owners, because what they obtained by charterers' breach was bunkers of a higher value than they would have had under the charter party. But it's quite hard to make it out from the award exactly which way the balance of account would have gone.
Sounds good. All right. There we are. I think 20 minutes, bang on, almost, thereabouts. Well, look, thanks for listening in, everyone. We hope you've enjoyed going through a quick course on bunkers on redelivery and how to price them in the event that charterers have delivered too much at redelivery. Calum, always a pleasure. Until next time, take care, everyone.
Cheers, Luke.